Okay, my name's Russell Davies, and I want to welcome you all to, for those who don't know me, most of you probably do, but welcome to our final Sundays at Belmont for 2022. As you can see, our topic is about climate, copping in as opposed to copping out, play on obviously COP27, which is just concluded. So we're pleased to have two very skilled speakers with us tonight. Firstly, James and also Mikhail. Nikki will introduce Mikhail in a little bit more detail when he comes to speak to us, but we're going to kick off with James, who is part of our church here, enrolled as a member, I think, a few months ago, but been a friend of IUC for many years. For those of you who don't know, James is a senior lecturer at UCT in the Health Sciences Department, but has a special interest in climate. He's been a climate activist for many years. He has a MSc in climate, so this has really been his field of study and lecturing and teaching and encouraging others to address these kind of issues for many years. So James is going to speak to us first and focus really around what happened at COP, for those of you who haven't caught up, and also to speak a little bit about what's the implications of that for South Africa and how South Africa is addressing the climate issues. And then we'll hand over to Mikhail, who's going to bring it much more local and talk about what the city of Cape Town is doing. But we'll get to that soon. But first of all, if you can give James a welcome. Thank you.
All right, so thank you, Russell, for that welcome and for suggesting the idea of this Sundays at Belmont to close the series. As Russell said, I teach in the Faculty of Health Sciences in the Division of Environmental Health. And in those sort of 7 or 8 years that I've been teaching on climate change and health, increasingly people are becoming more aware of the topic. So when I tell them what I teach, I get often questions of what's the connection between climate and health, and I will explain a bit of that later. But before I get there, for those of you who are already UC would have heard me speaking about the COP conference, would have seen it in the media, and we're here to consider the global picture of COP, the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, and then to think locally, what does it mean for us? Because in a sense, we're all parties to climate change, not just those who go to these conferences every year, but climate change is something that affects all of us, and all of us have a say, and all of us have agency. And so, although there are some very difficult truths about climate change, my hope is that by the end of this presentation and Mikhail's presentation and our discussion, that we will leave here with some hope and some commitment to how we, as active citizens, concerned citizens, and members of RUC can cop in and make a difference. Okay, so I've got about 15 minutes to present, and I'll just give you a bird's eye view of the COP conference that ended last weekend after 2 weeks in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, a resort town right at the end of the Sinai Peninsula, and ironically, lots of carbon emissions were emitted by all the thousands of guests flying in and conferring there in air-conditioned comfort in the middle of the desert. And the theme of the conference was Together for Implementation, and the hope of the president was that this would be an opportunity to showcase unity against an existential threat, and for Egypt to showcase that it could host this prestigious conference. Well, did it live up to that hope, Together for Implementation? Well, this report from Bloomberg that was published a few days ago did speak about some of the gains, and the term loss and damage might be a term that you've become familiar with. Essentially, it's about setting up a fund to compensate countries that are being affected by the losses and damages of climate change. Okay, so when you see on the news extreme storms and flooding and fires, all of those are exacting a massive toll on people and on the infrastructure and on the economies of countries. And many of those countries in the developing world, where historically they have contributed least to climate change through the emissions that are driving global heating, and yet are least prepared for these massive impacts. And so it becomes a matter of climate justice. How do we achieve some kind of justice for those most affected? How much are the wealthy countries prepared to pay up for the losses and damages that have been incurred? Sorry, then also there were some other achievements. So there were some settings around carbon markets, the idea of carbon trading. So wealthy countries being able to offset some of the carbon emissions through funding carbon sink projects in developing countries, projects that draw carbon out of the atmosphere. Many criticize it as just a way of rich countries continuing to get away with emitting carbon instead of restructuring the economies. The 1.5 degree goal, so that's what you might have heard of. 1.5 degrees was the goal set at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015 as a target that scientists have said we cannot, as a world, heat the globe above 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial averages without causing significant climate change. And so after Paris, countries set targets that they would commit to meet by 2025 or 2030 to try and reduce emissions so that globally we would stay within that goal. Increasingly, it seems like we're going to overshoot that. Estimates say we might, at the current trajectory, reach 2.5 to 2.8 degrees of warming. Okay, that's a global average. So it means that in some more vulnerable areas, hotspots around the equatorial regions in Africa, the heating could be a lot more than that, up to even double. Okay, so that obviously has significant impacts for people's livelihoods, and we will see people migrating out of those areas where it just becomes unbearably hot to live. And then there was some progress on methane emissions. So methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, 20 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And so 150 countries have apparently signed up to a pledge to cut emissions of that by the end of the decade. So there have been some positives, but essentially many have said it wasn't enough. The Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance warned that despite COP27 being billed as an African COP, it is ending leaving millions of Africans in continued climate-related misery. And this was Rico's view, that COP27 was a totally ineffectual response to the climate emergency that we're facing. And many are questioning whether flying lots of people to these conferences anymore is actually worthwhile. Yet, the same article also spoke about some of the positives through the legal channels and reform and science and research. So, as one tries and moves beyond the COP consensus to see whether we can, in the legal sphere, for example, bring in laws that make it that produce regulatory frameworks for companies to measure and disclose their decarbonisation targets. So by holding people accountable before the law, the science and research has advanced in leaps and bounds since the Intergovernmental Climate Change Panel started its work over 25 years ago. And so we're now more certain than ever what the science tells us about the impacts and how to mitigate those. And then there are various other coalitions around targeting reduction of emissions in some high emitting industries, so in mining, aluminium, aviation, chemicals, shipping, steel, and trucking. So these are attempts to try and make progress while the COP process seems to have reached a ceiling of what is possible. Another positive from the conference was the adaptation agenda. Okay, so this was, when we talk about adaptation, we're talking about the measures that can be taken by societies to lessen the impacts of climate change. So, for example, planting more trees to cool down cities, improving public transport and non-motorized transport to reduce emissions and make people healthier, and educating people about how to act within their spheres of influence to make our societies more resilient to a different climate future. Again, these agendas are all very well, but they need leadership and they need finance, and many see the agenda as well-meaning, but where's the money going to come from to bring about the adaptation that is needed? According to this report, Our Planet in Peril, what climate science is saying, it was released just before the COP, there's a limit to how far societies can adapt. And that's again, for adaptation to succeed, we need targeted financing, financing from different sources, as we'll see. South Africa has been the beneficiary of some of that, and more effective governance from national to provincial to local, to really drive the changes. And we're talking about revolutionary changes in how society operates. So our Minister, Barbara Creasy, Minister of the Department of Forestry and the Environment, expressed some disappointment about the appetite for a firm work program on adaptation, and said that they were disappointed that there wasn't more on how adaptation is going to work, because countries like South Africa that are being increasingly impacted need firm commitment to that. And then another thing that was not given enough attention, although it featured at COP more than in the past, was the impact of the food system. And since we hosted the Sustainable Supper here in September, I thought this was relevant for us to know that our food and agriculture are responsible for 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and about 1/3 of all food produced is wasted. And wasted food, rotting food, gives rise to methane, which, as you heard, is a powerful greenhouse gas, as well as farming livestock and cattle for the grain beef industry, also has massive impact on methane emissions. So when we think about how we can make a difference to climate change, considering our diets and the way in which food is produced and wasted or not, is a massive area of leverage. Okay, then here is a landmark moment where South Africa presented its just transition ambitions to the international partners group. So these are partners in the EU, UK, France, Germany, the US. Germany that have pledged 8.5 billion over the next 3 to 5 years in the form of grants and concessional loans and investments to help South Africa transition away from our coal-fired power system, largely, to renewable energy because of the climate emissions and because of the environmental impacts of burning coal and the pollution that it causes. And South Africa was commended for its transition plan. It presented this investment plan for the next 5 years or so. And 3 priority sectors have been identified in the plan. They are electricity, new energy vehicles, so electric vehicles rather than petrol combustion, and green hydrogen, with the goal of decarbonizing the country's economy by 2030 to meet the commitments that we made after the Paris Climate Conference. And so just some slides from that investment plan show some of the challenges that we face in terms of the huge amounts. The 1.5 trillion is the estimate, and although the 8.5 billion is welcomed, it still leaves a massive gap in raising the deficit. And where is that funding going to come from? This just shows the arenas of action for just transition. And the Presidential Climate Commission, which was established in 2020 to advise the presidency on our climate response, is commended for having done a lot of consultations around the country, particularly in the areas in the Mpumalanga Highveld, where most of the coal mining happens, where people obviously are more concerned about their job security than mitigating our climate emissions. Although they have been living with the pollution impacts of all that coal for decades. And so it is one of the most toxic areas of the world in terms of air pollution. And so obviously trying to reduce that and to create jobs for people in the, the renewable sector has a win-win. So this just looks at some of the of where the funding is going. So this is the 1.5 trillion, and you can see there that the majority will go to decarbonising our energy sector. And Andre de Ruyter, CEO of Eskom, is on record just the other day of saying that this is a no-brainer, that the whole energy transition worldwide has meant that renewable energy is the cheapest and obviously the most environmentally beneficial option. And South Africa, in fact, has a competitive advantage when it comes to our wind and solar resources. And so it's the sort of political delays and corruption that has meant that we're not as far advanced with our renewable energy program as we should be. But it obviously has a massive impact for reskilling people who have only known employment in the coal value chain to engage with a whole different set of skills. And then a much smaller portion is going into the producing new electric vehicles, so decarbonising the automotive sector, so transport accounts for so large proportion of our emissions, and then the green hydrogen sector, which is all about producing energy from hydrogen cells. I'm not too sure how the technology works, but again, it is something that has great promise as the technology has advanced to decarbonise and to produce energy far more efficiently and in a less polluting way. So, financing that just shows the projected needs and availability. So you can see there the IPG offer, that's the International Partners Group, the 8.5 billion, is just a small proportion of the 1.5 trillion that is needed over the next 5 years or so. And so South Africa is looking to investors, they're looking to development banks, they're looking to the private sector and philanthropies to make up the deficit. And that is needing strong leadership and champions in government. Okay, and so I just also showcase this timeline of our policy and regulatory frameworks and foundations around climate and the just transition. I first became involved in climate and health and attended my first COP in Durban in 2011, so that was over a decade ago. And at that time, as a host country, South Africa wanted to show that it was being progressive on climate policy, and so it has a national climate change adaptation strategy that was it had firstly a national climate response policy, and then with consultation it's developed adaptation strategies, the climate change bill, the Presidential Climate Commission, and the Just Transition has really brought decision-making around climate right into the centre of government. So there is progress in terms of the policy and regulatory framework, but together for implementation. Where is implementation? Can we see that this plan is now going to be followed through? So that just brings me to some ideas from colleagues at UCT on what South Africa must do to build climate resilient development And at UCT, we have world-class academics who have been involved in the authoring of the climate evidence from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they conclude in this piece that while the country has put a lot in place to ramp up climate action, and we've seen that through the policy and regulatory frameworks, and they've done planning and consultation with affected communities with the just transition, they warn against spending too much time trying to plan the perfect response. Learning by doing is necessary, accompanied by the reflections of a broad group of stakeholders. And Mark Haywood in the Daily Maverick spoke about the need for political will, that with all the climate evidence and the science, we need the political will, we need the leadership, and we need the finance to go with that. So I'll just end with some bringing it home a bit. So with a group in our Division of Environmental Health, we produced a policy brief to help inform the Western Cape Government's climate change response strategy, which was updated in 2018 and most recently again. And essentially what you see here in this diagram is looking at the Western Cape, what the evidence tells us about what we can expect in the next few decades. So increased average temperatures and frequency of hot days, increased drought events and intensification of rainfall and the changing rainfall seasons is something we've already seen. Rises in sea level and increased ocean temperatures that affects low-lying areas, and the increased chance of fire events. So all of these we've sort of seen in recent years, and the climate, the evidence is clear that these will become more frequent. And the impact on health, which is my particular area of interest, the ones in bold there are the ones that are sensitive to climate. So interpersonal violence, when it's hot, it increases conflict and violence. The air pollution obviously has an impact on cardiorespiratory health, and we already have high incidence of that, with TB being very prevalent in our country. And then we see the vulnerable populations, so the members of our society that need to be prioritized with any climate response. So people with pre-existing conditions, those living in poverty and informal housing, these are the kind of populations that we'll hear more about from the Climate Action Plan and what is being done to address them. So the idea of climate change is a risk amplifier, amplifying existing risks that are more severe, where societies have vulnerable groups, and that can be lessened where one is building greater resilience. And so much of Cape Town's climate risk is due to high levels of vulnerability in terms of where we're located, in terms of the migration into the city and the housing backlog, in terms of the legacy of historical planning decisions, so infrastructure being inappropriately located, and then the adaptive capacity of local government. And that's where I'm going to hand over to Mikhail to talk us through the Climate Action Plan.
Time to introduce our next speaker, and I've asked Nikki just to tell us a little bit more about him before he addresses us.
Thanks very much. We're very privileged to have Councillor Mikhail Manuel here this evening. He is the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee for Urban Mobility in the City of Cape Town, which means he plays a strong oversight role for what the municipality is doing. He's also your ward councillor, and so is involved in many local issues. And he's also an urban activist. And I think he brings many qualities to those roles. And not only is he got the skills through his training in having a master's in transport studies, but he's also very keen to be engaging on topics and have these sorts of discussions. So very open and really wanting to, as an urban activist, wanting to make a difference. So thanks very much, Mikhail, for making the time available and joining us this evening.
Okay. Thanks so much for inviting me. Nikki reached out to me about it. I was quite excited. Even though your job in council primarily is to debate, there's very little debate that happens, or at least constructive discussion, where even if you disagree with each other, you're still willing and able to continue to work together and find solutions. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a very quick presentation, sort of an overview of some of the risks for the city, and then I will focus, I'll hone in a bit more on particularly transport matters. I will mention a couple projects that ties into what James has said, just as examples of what the city is doing, and then we can have a discussion or questions or whatever it may be. Cool, so James started stealing some of my slides, so I'm glad that he stopped. Essentially, Cape Town has, let me just look at this quickly, 7 main risks that we face as a result of climate change. These are a decrease in the average annual rainfall, increasing temperature, as you can see, change in seasonality of rainfall, increase heat waves or very hot days, an increase in wind. I actually found that one quite interesting. The sea level rise, we've heard a lot about that, and then major rainstorms. I want to use one example of how we may be experiencing that already. Of course, anecdotal evidence can always be refuted, but one example is this year in May, about the 27th of May, I think it was, there was a really intense storm in Cape Town, and that was all of May and all of June and half of July's rain fell in 3 days. So what that means, and this is where local government becomes very exciting, what that means is that, that has direct impact on whether or not your house floods, on whether or not you have electricity, and it's all about our systems are not designed for that level of rainfall in that period of time. They're designed for, yes, perhaps 100 millimeters of rain, but over the period of 7 days or something of that nature. Which then I think makes the reasons for our risk being quite interesting. With Cape Town being a developed and developing city, I was chatting to James earlier about the interaction between informality and formality, and I think that's one of the reasons why we are, at such a high level of vulnerability, which is what that says, for those that perhaps can't see it. We have so much pressure to spend money on so many different things, partly because of the political landscape, but partly because we still have a lot of informality in the city, and because of our history rather, there is a pressure on the government to provide things which traditionally a city government wouldn't provide, like housing, for example. So it's considered that we have high levels of vulnerability, and that's why we are at risk. And those vulnerabilities is a little bit of what I touched on right now, which, James, this is the first slide still. So what you see in the top top left-hand corner, that's Spine Road. And it was very interesting, in Spine Road, in about June, I think it was, for the first time in decades, that Spine Road collapsed. And it collapsed because of a storm event. Now, Spine Road is built in the middle of a wetland, right? But we've never had such an extreme storm event to actually cause the road to collapse, and so it took close part of the M3, etc. And so that refers to a lot of the physical and geographical vulnerabilities. A lot of people live on very high, water tables. Even in Rosebank, where if you live in Rosebank, which is like the village green, and there's a canal, etc., that water table for that village green is actually really high. So when it rains, it very quickly floods into stark areas because the water table is really high, so just a little bit of rain, and then all the kind of outlet pipes push back and start gets floods. And And in addition to that, a lot of people live not only in the CBD, where there's a lot of kind of physical control measures. A lot of people live down, what is the name of the road? That goes all the way down to the bottom, towards Kailicha, past Muizenberg. Ben Powell Drive, where they're constantly battling sand, high winds, and then of course lots of rain. And then what brings with that is unstable surfaces, etc. Then you have social vulnerabilities. Now, Cape Town, as many of you may know by now, had a lot of land invasions during the COVID period. They seemed quite organized because in a matter of days or weeks, thousands of people suddenly took up, vacant public land. And it's not, I don't refer to what we see in the southern suburbs. This is not land invasions. This is just a homeless camp that's been set up there. I'm referring to someone comes in with stakes and particularly blue plastic and cordons off plots. One night, the next day, someone comes in, people arrive with, metal sheeting and suddenly pulled, and you'll have a whole development cropping up immediately. Now, what that introduces is more often than not, those informal properties are being built or being developed on floodplains, where the city has intentionally kept it clear because it will flood every single year because all the water is designed to run to that point. What it then also creates is where I can use an example from Burkhardt, for example. Burkhardt has traditionally very Muslim and coloured Cape Malay residents, and with all of these land grabs, there's a park towards the back of Burkhardt that has a sort of very big quarry, and quite a few shacks were built on the back of people's houses, causing safety concerns for them. And the people who built the shacks, they weren't locals from Burkhardt or even from other parts of Cape Town, they were foreign nationals who would then come in and set up these structures, which flares up a whole bunch of issues around the dignity of people because their houses are flooding, month in, month out, or every season, winter in, winter out. Even though the city has said, don't build here. But then on the other hand, also you have locals having very increasingly kind of, what's that word? Strained relationships with their fellow residents. And those are all more very immediate concerns. It's not referring to more long-term concerns when we start competing for work. Of course, we already see that, but I don't think that the competition for work that happens right now is as a result of a strain on them because of the environment. I think it's just because some people are more go-getter than others, perhaps, and so they feel like there's an advantage towards farmers. But social vulnerabilities, because people are so desperate or are so used to being maligned because of our history, the moment you introduce a new factor into that environment, it just flares up quite quickly. Then, one thing, of course, is the legacy of our historical planning decisions, and that's just, the fact that you have nice Cape Town, where we live, and not so nice Cape Town, where a lot of other people live. And the cost of running a city like that, sort of from our own perspective, for the city's finances, the costs are exponential. But also for people's own household budgets, the impact is severe. And that has a direct impact on, as things become more expensive, because of climate change, we have to travel further for work, etc., and it makes it more difficult to live there. And the last one is capacity government to respond. I don't have particular examples about this. Yeah, maybe I do have one. Because I chair the Committee on Urban Mobility, winter readiness, essentially, preparing for winter, clearing out all the channels and the catchments, etc., is one of the hot topics on our agenda every single year. We probably have the most arguments or kind of, I don't know, I suppose arguments between officials and between colleagues or politicians particularly about this topic. And it's because in a case like, when you have all this flooding happening in 3 days, the city doesn't have the capacity to respond to that kind of thing. Same issues with power outages. So for parts of Rosebank and Rondebosch, I think parts of News, we were without power for 2 or 3 days because we just didn't have enough generators, or we just didn't, we're not prepared for that level of storm, which I think is an example of climate change. So these are the real 4 of the kind of the major risks that we face. And then there's just a nice picture of the documents that we created of the strategy and action plan. I don't think this is the first iteration. I think there have been a number of these. Someone else might know better than me. Which is obviously always very good. So then the way one solves these problems, that's the very detailed slides. I won't leave it up there, but these next ones essentially is just the same thing, but it was nice to look at. There's a whole range of ways that one can solve the problems. And I won't give examples for all of them because I just don't know examples for all of them. But there are examples in a number of places. Of course, how do you prevent people from getting very sick when it is hot or cold? We all experienced the drought in 2018, so we know what that's like. As a result, there was actually one project that we approved in council in September this year, which was to draw water from the Berg River into the Berg River Dam in winter, or in summer, sorry, so that we would then have extra capacity in the summer season, in the dry season. So that's an example of how we are trying to mitigate against, or adapt, sorry, to climate change issues. Winter sensitivity, coastal management, managing the fires, of course it's fire season right now, spatial resource inclusivity, carbon neutral energy and work creation. One of the things over there, of course, is that next year we're going to be building a solar power plant out in Atlantis. That is not really being driven by climate change concerns or wanting to be a good kind of energy conscious city, but rather by the fact that load shedding is quite frustrating and we do need to bring it to an end. And then, of course, a lot of the city buildings pursue, especially the new ones, pursue kind of being very emissions conscious, which is obviously very good. We'll get to number 9, the mobility issue in a while, and then circular waste economy. The one thing I wanted to mention here is that people often complain about bin pickers in this ward, Newlands, Claremont, etc. But there's national government policy which says that we have to account for the informal economy around waste, which is item 10. And so as a result, it's actually illegal to put locks on your bin because you are robbing that informal picker from the economy to select waste. To collect waste. There are more formal ways in which we facilitate that circular waste economy, and that is in the Atlantic seaboard and the northern suburbs, and I think in Pinelands they have recycling services provided by the city. We don't have it here just yet because we need to build a processing plant, but nonetheless there are drop-off facilities, and there are so many private providers. Actually, a new one started in Rosebank about 4 weeks ago or so. And it's becoming increasingly cheaper. So then on to transport. There we go. Just because I find that most exciting. So with electrical alternative fuels, I find it interesting that the national government says we're going to pursue green hydrogen, because hydrogen has been spoken about for the last 15 years. We were pursuing hydrogen. It'd be lovely if we did it, because yes, there is a great resource available, but I'm yet to see any kind of impetus, to be honest. On the electric front, it's really interesting. Some of them comment about funding sources and vested interests, particularly around electric vehicles. It is insanely interesting. I won't go into it now, it's just too much to mention. But one thing that I thought was very encouraging, I have an example, it's not been driven by the city, it's by a private company called Go Metro, who have imported the first electric minibus taxi and who are running pilot programs across the city in partnership with, I think, the Western Cape government, to try and get the minibus taxi industry to actually get electric taxis. Of course, my city service also wants to have electric buses, but quicker to the mark was Golden Arrow, and they at the moment, they've been piloting 2 electric vehicles, electric buses. You may see it on the main road every now and again. But what is more impressive is they put in an order for 60 additional buses. And in a meeting some time ago, they believe that electric vehicles, even though they aren't, in the South African context, even though they aren't as emissions friendly as clean petrol vehicles, they are either cheaper to run or are as expensive to run as diesel buses. So for as long as they have price parity, they will continue to roll out electricity. And with the Ukraine war, we all know that fuel is insanely expensive, and so they're obviously still winning Golden Arrow. The last thing I wanted to say is that, in my opinion, and this is not the city's opinion, but my opinion, we can pursue electric vehicles all we like, but it's irrelevant if we don't have clean energy. And in South Africa, because we have so much cheap coal and so many invested interests in coal, I will take my hat off to the national government if they genuinely pursue cheap energy, clean energy, and genuinely opt not for coal. I can see how city governments are starting to say, we just need our own power, and so we're going to produce clean energy. But the economic decision, the short-term economic decision to continue to rely on coal is so attractive, even though I think that we need to transition. And then, of course, rail, we all know the massive importance of rail and how we're pursuing that, just for kind of doing our studies in the meantime. I don't think that there is a significantly different impetus to devolve rail to the city, even though we really wanted to be arguing for it harder than ever before. But it has been legally possible to devolve rail since 1996, and every couple of years the national government talks about how we must devolve rail. So I think this is just political posturing, but I would love to see rail devolved, and we are fighting really hard for it. Then there is about just testing and measuring. Okay, we'll come to that, so I'm going to leave that for last. Then travel demand management. So I'm glad there are quite a few younger people here. Anybody who works from home, please continue to work from home. That is one of the kind of policy points that the city is really trying to push, because it changes travel patterns. And when you take travel patterns, you reduce the amount of time in traffic, which reduces your emissions. Congestion is really, really bad in the city, and so getting that travel demand management right is really important to us. I think that it's slightly too early days to begin to implement some more advanced ideas, like we have like here in London, where there's kind of costing rings, and if you enter a certain area, you start paying for it. We do certainly try and do that through paid parking, which does cost the rate nothing, but it helps to reduce congestion. Then active mobility, we're always trying to find ways to actually get more people to walk and cycle, particularly with Nikki shouldn't know this, but what we're going to start pushing for as a committee is that you see more of the rainbow crossing. I don't know if everybody knows about that. It's a very colourful. Okay, in Greenpoint, there's a colourful pedestrian crossing where the legal requirement is for 2 white lines, and the 2 white lines are still there. What you do between those 2 white lines is completely not regulated. So what we've done is we've put a rainbow flag in between, particularly in support of I want to say gay rights, gay movement, I suppose, LGBTIQ movement. So that's because it's relevant to that particular sector. I'm trying to do something similar along Campground Road, for where the cycling track crosses the road, but I'm thinking of doing it in the colours of the schools in the area. So the committee wants to see more of these kind of exciting and attractive things to get people to actually use bicycle and cycle more. Then the last one about integration, there is a business plan coming to the city, coming to council, I think next year, February. It was supposed to come in October, but it didn't, or November, sorry, but it couldn't get there. Where we are trying to make it possible to use your cell phone or your ordinary bank card to tap in and out of My City. And that's very helpful. It uses legislation around what's called account-based ticketing. And that's very helpful because right now it's really difficult to get a ticket or to get a card. It's very cumbersome, and so I think that's one of the main reasons why we don't actually use public transport or My City. And the last thing I wanted to mention was just testing and measuring, because I find it very interesting. And this is probably the one thing the city's doing the most of. Now you get backwards. Let's see the electrified. So it's testing and measuring. The city does so much testing and measuring to actually have a decent understanding of. We spend a lot of time collecting data so that we know where to invest in infrastructure, but it also shows the extent to which vehicular traffic contributes to emissions. So what I'm going to do is, you'll see that the timestamp is 5:15 in the morning, and we've been able to track movements. Now, because the more time you spend in traffic, oh, there's one more, the more emissions you emit. We have a very big incentive to reduce emissions from the transport industry. We're the second biggest contributor in the city, I think after energy is the biggest contributor. And the last thing I want to mention is what I actually think is the most climate-friendly thing that we could ever do. And I only think it's this exciting because it bucks the trend of what's become very popular to use plastic in everything. So we're putting plastic in everything, we get rid of it out of the dumps and that kind of stuff and create more space. And it's good to do that, and we're doing it in some places. But this particular project it reuses the existing material. So we recently acquired a machine, which all contractors found contractors who had their technology, which on Jack's Herald Drive, they were able to cut up a piece of the road, use that existing material, just mix it with, I think it was limestone and fresh bitumen essentially, and then put that same material back and extend the life by, I think it was 20 or 25 years, something of that nature. Now that is way more climate friendly or environmentally friendly than even going to pick and find plastic, because even that energy consumption, there is nothing more efficient than reusing the thing that you already have. And so I think it's very exciting. It's a very engineering type of kind of thing to be excited about, but you don't often hear about stuff like this, whereas actually it's the best example of the city's attempts to be more conscious of what's happening in the environment. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. Okay, I think we're out of time, and I guess the other basic point is why we're talking about this even as a church, and I think Robert touched on that previously in sermons, care of the earth, being stewards of the created order that we have. So I guess that's all, why we're even having this conversation. It's not just about our own sustainability, but the sustainability of the planet that we are stewards of. So thank you everyone for participating and the different points of view. Thank you, Henry, not only for your contrary views, but also the beverages and the refreshments you brought along. Henry's been doing that for all of us others at Belmont. So thank you, Henry. And we'll be in touch about the program for next year. Thank you again to our speakers, James and Mikhail. Good night.